You're listening to Natural Resources University. This episode features Timber University, hosted by Dr. Brady Self and Dr. Sean Tanger.
Welcome to the Timber University podcast, brought to you by Mississippi State University Extension Forestry and the University of Arkansas at Monticello's Forest Business Center. I'm Sean Tanger.
And I'm Brady Self. We're both forestry specialists covering topics from soils to silviculture to social sciences as they pertain to forest stewardship.
In this podcast, we'll extend research findings and professional experiences that are relevant to forest landowners, consultants, loggers, and other natural resource professionals.
If you fall into one of those categories, we'll help you explore historical and current science that you can apply to your practical forestry knowledge and experiences. All right, on today's episode of Timber University, we're going to talk about kind of the first nitty-gritty treatment category for forest management that we deal with. And this is something that's universal. I don't guess it has to be universal, but if you're into artificial regeneration or most intensive management, this is going to be something that's universal. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about things from a pine silviculture standpoint or from a hardwood silviculture standpoint, and that's site preparation. And what a lot of people don't really realize when you start talking about site prep, most of us, henceforth site preparation is going to be site prep for me. Hence, a lot of people don't really think about it from the aspect of if you really break it down, there's two, or at least, and depending on how you want to think of it, three overall general categories of site preparation. The one most people go to is going to be chemical, right? And then maybe they pick up mechanical, but fire is actually in there, and it kind of fits somewhere in between. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about really mechanical and chemical site preparation. So I want to preface this, this entire talk off of, just an overall generalized definition of what site preparation is. And I'm reading straight out of the silviculture textbook here. Site preparation is any silvicultural treatment applied to debris, ground story vegetation, forest floor, or soil to make a site more suitable for your regeneration efforts. So doing something to that site to get the conditions more conducive to growing that crop of trees. That's what we're talking about. And it's before you ever put trees in the ground. So it allows you a lot of leeway in what you do out there. So long as you're legal, you can do it because you don't have to worry about damaging those crop trees. So, from a mechanical standpoint, that's what I'm going to cover first. There's a lot of different treatments out there. A lot of these are going to be more historical, and they're not going to be things that we necessarily use like we used to. But everything from bush hogging and mowing to shearing and chopping and drum chopping, if the listeners remember those, disking, subsoiling, creating ditches and draining sites, scalping, bedding, combination plowing, and then combinations of all those different things. And there's probably something that I'm not covering there. There's a lot of different techniques out there, a lot of different things that have been used historically, but they're expensive, right? A lot of those were before the advent of herbicides, and because of that, they were good in their day, I guess, but they didn't really do what we can do with herbicides for much, much, much less expense. And then, like I said, we'll talk about prescribed fire a little bit, and then a little bit about a lot more about herbicides as we move on down it.
Well, and the cost with the mechanical, you see it a lot more for after devastation events, things like that, where there's just so much biomass material on the ground. You need something like a drum chopper, et cetera, but as Brady said, right, the more equipment, heavy equipment that you're going to have on the site, the cost just exponentiate very quickly.
Absolutely. And again, historically, though, it wasn't necessarily under that guise of management.
That's right,
that's just what we had.
Right.
We didn't have anything better. And it was cheaper to do back in that day and time, too. Economy of scale, it's a lot harder to find somebody now.
Sure.
So even before you really start talking about treatments and things to put on the ground, you really need to back up and think of it. As foresters, we have this tendency to just put blanket prescriptions on things, right? This is what you do because you have to do it. In one of the previous podcast episodes, you said, students say we thin at age 15. Site preparation is not that different. We think we have to do it, and 99% of the times we probably do, but there are times where we don't. So you always go out and you really need to think about things from a needs standpoint, whether you really need to do it. Some of those factors that play into there are things like vegetation. How big is the vegetation? What's the composition of the vegetation? Pines need a total, or can stand a lot less competition than a lot of hardwoods. Depending on, even inside of hardwoods, some species of hardwoods can take a lot of on-site competition. Some can't take any. Something like a cottonwood, if it gets grass on it, it's gone, right? An oak, it'll keep chugging along. It just depends on what you're looking at. And then, of course, the soils aspect of it. Not necessarily a qualitative standpoint here from a soils aspect, but things like the drainage classes. How wet that soil is, and then are there restrictive layers? Is it compacted? Something like an old field, retired agricultural area, in to be politically correct, or a pasture. Some of those situations you have traffic pans that you don't necessarily have in a forested site. So again, you're thinking about this from a need standpoint. What do I really need to do on site on any given stand? So if we really back down and we get to the basics of what we can do from a mechanical standpoint, I listed off a whole list of things a couple of minutes ago that are out there. Those are treatments that we have used in the past, and we really don't use that many of them anymore. There's a little bit of shearing that goes on, not a whole lot, but a little bit of shearing. But most of the shearing and the chopping and the drainage, drainage treatments, those are gone. We just don't do a lot of them. You're starting to see kind of a resurgence in some areas with shearing, where they're pushing that blade across the site in like some plantation thinnings and things like that, where it's pre-commercial if you get right down to it, but just not wholesale. We haven't seen that. It's out there, but not a lot of it. And then burning, and I love burning. I'm a certified prescribed burn manager. I love burning. I go and volunteer 2 or 3 times a year in that world, but there's a reason why industry doesn't do it, and that comes down to cost, and it comes down to liability that's associated with it. So we're not going to talk a whole lot about any of those, but I will cover some of the others a little more in depth.
Let me interject, if you don't mind, just
Absolutely.
a question. You said the shearing, you're starting to see some of it come back. In what context? What is that? What are people using it for?
Where I've seen it, and I haven't seen it in Mississippi much. I've seen it actually doing retro conversion in pines, where they're going in and leveling stands of pulpwood because they, like we've talked about before, people are, in this case, you can't even say liquidating it because they're not getting money. They're paying to lay it back down, and they're putting beans back in those fields that they planted. I've seen that, and then I've seen some of the thinnings basically performed with it in CRP style hardwoods in the Delta in Arkansas. I have not actually seen that in Mississippi yet, but it has a lot of promise, where they're actually going in and doing row thinning with D8s and D9s with giant V blades on them, and it actually looks pretty dang good. Those stands look. You couldn't do it with a skidder and do it any cleaner. Let's just say it that way. It's kind of impressive, the work I've seen.
Interesting.
And then, of course, there's a lot of differences between pines and hardwoods. Anything that you do in hardwoods, you're probably going to have to carry that money a lot longer in your world, right?
Yeah.
There's physiological differences between your different species and how they react to added sunlight and compaction in ground. I mean, all sorts of things there. And then move over into the herbicidal world. Obviously, we have some species considerations there. And then typical site conditions when you go from bottoms to uplands, right? So in hardwoods, especially bottomland hardwoods, we're more worried about rutting and compaction of the ground and things like that than you would be in the uplands with more traditionally from pine sites. So a lot of things that come into play that make you think about it. So I guess we start really with the most basic, the first tier type of mechanical site preparation. That's bush hogging, mowing, mulching, whatever you want to call it. There's lots of different treatments and lots of different things that you'll hear it called. And at the end of the day, we're talking about the same treatment, really, which is you're physically cutting vegetation down. You're not harvesting it. You're not doing anything else with it. You're just cutting it down. Really, the only, from a silvicultural standpoint, the biggest boom you get there is you get easier access to a planting site, right? It's easier for a planting crew to come through and stick trees in the ground. You don't get any competition control from it. If anybody doesn't believe that, just go out and look at a field of sweet gum, that's had sweet gum rise in it, and mow it, and tell me what happens 2 months later when you come back.
Yeah, looks like you never did anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you don't get a lot from it from a silvicultural standpoint. Wildlifers will use it a little bit. They don't like it that much either, really, from what I've seen. But they, you do have some wildlife uses that you'll see. You'll see wildlife biologists use it every now and then. That's kind of the old standard of bush hogging. With a pull behind on a tractor, or even some of the bigger units that are out there. Then you get into the really big, I don't want to say big, but the really powerful treatments where they're going in, they're mulching or they're grinding trees. And that one, you can clean up a site. Absolutely. You can go in and you can cut some pretty large trees. I've seen some skid steers with mulcher heads on them. They're taking 8, 9, 10-inch pines down. Now, they're grinding on them a while, but time is money, right? That's one of those things, and you hear that a fair amount, and I've seen where it absolutely looks good, and it probably did what the landowner was shooting for from a maybe not a competition control standpoint. In some cases, maybe, but usually they're trying to quote unquote clean a site up. They're trying to open it up and thin it in some cases. But when it gets to the cost, that's where it comes in. Yeah. And it's pretty funny. I've asked several vendors this around the state. Well, what do you charge per acre? Oh, well, I don't know. It's a per hour and blah blah. Whatever the cost may be per hour. Well, how many hours does it take you to do an acre? And that's the proper answer. And then they really start hawing around. Low end, $200, $250 an acre, upwards of $400, $500, $600 in some extreme cases. Can't pay for that. Not especially not at the beginning of site preparation where you're carrying that cost for so long. Even in pines, you can't pay for that. So it's really an aesthetics thing. You hear a lot of people out there. Well, there's one guy in particular from the northwest part of the state that I've asked, why do you bush hog that 200 acres out there? Well, it looks snaky. That at the end of the day, that's the answer. And sure. That's fine if that's what he wants to do, but it's a lot of expense to mow that thing with any kind of repetition. Mm-hmm. Move on up into the next kind of more intensive treatment. You get into disking. Really don't pick up much when you start talking about disking as opposed to bush hogging. You get a little bit better competition control because you're drying some roots out and things like that. Mm-hmm. The problem is you got to do it over and over and over, and it does induce sprouting in sprout prolific types of species. So not a lot. Doesn't really bring a lot to it. Doesn't do anything to correct restrictive layers. Those plow pans or traffic pans, if you want to call them anything. It doesn't really do anything unless you get into some major discs, and nobody really uses that kind of thing. You also have some issues from a planting standpoint. You ever try to plant seedlings in a disked up clay soil? Doesn't work so well. You got big air pockets, so trying to seal in those roots and things like that, it just doesn't work very well. That's it. It may be the only thing you've got at your disposal. If it is, it is. Just be very, very careful with that type of work. Then you get into subsoiling, ripping. You'll hear it called ripping a lot. Subsoiling is really kind of where real silvicultural site prep starts for me, where we don't get any competition control from it, but you do start getting some corrective benefits from that plow that's pulling under the ground. And what we're talking about there is a shank and different shapes and different widths of those and different depths that they go with. We don't have time to cover all those, but they pull a plow down there. That the idea being is that it rips, it breaks up that restrictive layer as it goes through. Does give you that. It does, in most of the research, show that it promotes growth and or survival. Yep. Not all of it, but most of the time you get some positive benefit from that particular treatment in a silvicultural sense of the word. And
that's from all the soil compaction from the operational stuff.
And even in situations where you don't have compaction, you get into scenarios where you just get not really soil tillage, but you get a zone of more friable soil as it fills in, and you get root penetration better is what it comes down to. Run into issues in that if you have heavy clays. If you get into situations where as it dries back out, the ground pops open, and if your seedling is planted in those in those slits, you get some drying issues there. But that's really where you start picking up some benefit from mechanical site prep. You get into bedding. You hear it called hipping sometimes, and with bedding, you don't get that corrective action from the restrictive layers. that are in the soil. You just basically think about bedding as small scale cultivation. You're throwing a little bed, 6 inches, 12 inches high, 3-4 feet wide, something like that. And so you do get a little bit of vegetative competition reduction, right? Because it is that short, very, very, very finite area that is being tilled up as it throws that bed up. But that's not what the intent of it was. If you go back and look at the design for bedding, or the original intent for bedding, the original intent was you throw that little bed up and it gets the roots out of a flooded site. It gave them a little bit of elevation. So if you have a saturated soil, you get the soil drying out a little faster, and you get a little bit more elevation, and water goes with gravity. So your seedlings don't drown is what it comes down to. Flip side of that is you get into a really droughty situation or a drier site than you intended, and you just blanket prescribe something like bedding, which not many people do, but there are some that do. And you run into the scenario of my roots are too dry, and I start getting some desiccation of the root systems and mortality that comes along with that. You do get better planting jobs, right? You've got rows, and it's easy to stick them in the ground, but there's always those trade-offs. So it's just something to think about if anybody's interested in bedding. Great, really great tool to have at your disposal, but it's really for more of a wetter site, just trying to get your seedling root systems up to a point where they don't dry out, to where they don't flood out. And then you get into combination plowing. You'll hear that called all kinds of different things. A lot of those are trademarked, like Savannah plows and 3-in-1 plows. But combination plowing, it uses some form of that subsoiler we talked about, and then a bedding plow on top of that, or disc blades that pull a bed on top. So you get both benefits of the subsoiler and of the bedding in that particular treatment. And that's kind of the most intensive. Now, costs, obviously the more intensive treatments are gonna run you more. That stands the test of time across pretty much anything. Mowing and bush hogging, it may be all you can find, and that's fair. And we already talked about some of the costs for mulching. At one point, not very far back, used to, right? In the good old days, and we're talking 4 or 5 years ago, you could still get forestry bush hogging done for $20 an acre. Checked on these prices back last fall, and I'm going to quote you as we go through this little list here. The cheapest I could find was about $40 an acre. So it's at least double, like everything else in the world, right?
Yeah.
That said, it's by far the easiest thing to find vendors for, or it may be a tool that you have at your disposal. So just go approach it from that standpoint.
And if you're even if you're relatively rookie to using those tools, you're a little more comfortable with something like that. Yeah.
Sure. And discing, upper end $75. If for forestry discing, something like that, $75. But down into that 30, maybe if you're really, really lucky range. It's just not as cheap as it used to be. Subsoiling. When I did my dissertation work, where I looked at a lot of mechanical site prep, I could get discing done in the 2010 era for $40, $45 an acre. It's $75, $80 an acre now. It's on upwards of $120, depending on the tool and the tractor they have to pull it with, and the terrain, like anything else. And then bedding and combination plowing starts at about $100, $175 respectively an acre, and it goes up. It all depends on who's the vendor is, how much acreage, where it's located, and anything else that plays into that.
Yep.
They all have their pros, they all have their cons, but that's kind of some averages for right now. Those numbers will change relatively soon. Like I said, we talked just briefly about fire. Fire from a site preparation standpoint, I look at fire, and I've caught flack about this many times from
I know where you're about to
from different
go.
wildlife people.
I know where you're heading.
But you have to realize that from what fire does is it resets vegetation, right? It resets succession. It doesn't control it. So it does not knock out, control, kill, eradicate, whatever you want to call it, whatever verb you want to use, whatever noun you want to use to describe what's going on. It does not control vegetation immediately. It takes multiple passes. You have to go over it and over and over to really get the benefit you're looking for from a silvicultural stance. Now, from a wildlife stance, best tool since butter and bread, right? But from a silvicultural standpoint, you don't get as much bang for your buck with, from a competition control standpoint, with fire. It does give you a better site. You can absolutely plant it better, but that vegetation is going to come back, and it's going to come back fast. So you may get a better planting job, but you're probably even going to potentially have even more competition, vegetative competition, than you did before. Is it relatively inexpensive? Sure. It gets into that range of subsoiling or the lower end of subsoiling or disking or something like that. $30-$35 an acre if you hire somebody to do it. Maybe 40 if you hire somebody to do it. You can do it yourself. If you go through the process, you can do it yourself for cheaper than that, but you're carrying all the liability if you're not hiring somebody to do it. And you have to do it over and over and over and over versus something herbicidal where it's hopefully if you do your research, everything aligns right. It's a one-time expense. That's the goal of chemical versus fire. Fire is a great tool, but it's I really do think of it as more of a wildlife aid, wildlife tool in that world. And there's a reason, like I said before, there's a reason why industry doesn't do it. Trust me, if somebody wants to make money, it's going to be industry. So from a purely financial silvicultural growth standpoint, it really doesn't bring as much to the table as some of the other treatments.
Sure.
Good tool, just not necessarily a perfect fit for what we're talking about here. Move on into the world of chemical site preparation. Like I said, initially, this is your best time, site prep. Before you plant trees, that's your best time to actually try to do any kind of site preparation. But chemical site preparation, where we're actually using herbicides to control that vegetation, of course, you're getting no corrective function out of these treatments from a soil standpoint. All you're doing is controlling vegetation with herbicides, but you don't have any crop trees in the ground, so you have the most flexibility to plant apply whatever you want. So long as you're inside the legal limitations of the law, whatever that herbicide label tells you, go with it. You're good to go. Because of that, not only can you have a flexibility of what product you put, but max rates too. So long as you allow enough time for that herbicide to not be damaging, have any residual effect to the trees you're trying to plant, put whatever you want on the ground.
Right, and that depends on the herbicide they're into.
The herbicide and the species you're planting.
Yeah.
And we'll cover that a little bit, not too much depth, but we'll cover that a little bit here in a minute. Typical timing in this part of the world is going to be early fall with the herbicides we're using and the process being there. You get over into the August, September, October time frame, plants are shutting down, they're absorbing that herbicide and they're pulling it back into the root system. It will work in the summer. Absolutely will work in the summer. The only time of the year that you really don't want to do much site prep type work is in the early spring, early to even mid-spring, when things are flushing out because everything's going up. Right? Mm-hmm. Everything in the plant's going up. So you can get some control, but usually what happens is you just blow the top of the plant out. You just top kill it, and you don't get a lot of benefit. You get what you get with fire. The same type of effect. A little bit more intense, but the same type of effect. Mm-hmm. So in this, depending on where you're at in the state, and I'm going to cover kind of north and south, the standard before 2020, 2021 was come in with basically a quart of a 2-pound imazapyr product, and we'll just run up the middle and say 5 quarts of glyphosate. And that could be any type of glyphosate that has a forestry label. That had gotten down to a point where we were able to get some of that done for $55 an acre in the north part of the state. That same treatment now is $120, or it was in late fall, the last cycle of applications out there. So it has more than doubled. A lot of that is related to the glyphosate cost, right? For any number of reasons we don't have time to talk about right now, mainly a supply chain thing. Mm-hmm. But it's gotten a lot more expensive, and because of that, we've seen some things change in what we're going to recommend out there. Now that was say in Mississippi, we'll go I-20 north. That was kind of the norm there. You get down below that, and you get into situations where you run into really waxy leaf species, things like yaupon and gallberry, and that particular slate of species. You have better luck, better control using keep the 2-pound imazapyr, but pick up drop the glyphosate out and pick up either a quart to a quart and a half of a triclopyr product. And this, one of the norms, and I'm not supporting any herbicide here. That's why I'm not giving actual herbicide trade names, but you get into some of the triclopyr products, they work better on those wax leaf species. They're able to get into the through the leaf cuticle and things like that with especially the ester formulations. So that was kind of the norm in the south part of the state. A quart of 2 pound of imazapyr and a quart to a quart and a half of an ester formulation of triclopyr. In the north, you drop the triclopyr and you pick up 5 quarts of glyphosate. That was the norm. Those were about 120 and $90 an acre in the fall, which went from, we'll say 55 to 60 and about 65 to 70, 2 years ago. Those prices really went up on people. Most of that's done with a helicopter. You can get some of it sprayed with a skidder or something like that, but most of it's done with a helicopter. Some of the other options that are out there for people, you can see because of the cost of glyphosate, we've seen some things change where you're seeing, instead of that being the norm, you're even in the north part of the state, you're seeing some people just go with triclopyr instead because it lowers it by $20, $30, $40 an acre, which is big money when you're talking about carrying it that far, or when you start looking at spreading it out over that many acres. So you're starting to see that shift. Well, not starting. We have seen that shift in the more common active ingredients that are applied out there, where we've seen the glyphosate drop out a lot, and it's not from the lawsuits and the settlements and all that like a lot of people think it is. It's just more expensive. It's in some cases quadrupled in price. We start talking to some of the farmers on the ag side with what they were paying for glyphosate versus in 2021 versus what they were paying in 2022. It tripled and quadrupled in price.
Is there a specific ingredient in that's jumped up relative to the others?
It's just the glyphosate salt. It's just the glyphosate itself. Most of it's produced overseas, and
gotcha.
We had just supply chain issues,
among
other things.
Yep.
And then every now and then you'll see some triple application or triple product applications where you have the glyphosate, the imazapyr, and the triclopyr all in one. You're talking up over $150 an acre. Those just aren't reasonable for most people. Now, you want to see a site that looks like a desert? You put that on it. I mean, it will absolutely annihilate it. And that kind of jogs the brain a little bit. That's a point that I didn't make. With site prep, we're not looking to control with chemical site prep, we're not looking to control every single stem of every species that's out there. If we get 90%, we're happy. Mm-hmm. If we get 95%, we're pretty ecstatic. That particular treatment I just mentioned with the triple AI, you can get 99. I mean, it will absolutely annihilate vegetation on site. Doesn't stick around. It's not a matter of it being an issue from a health standpoint or future growth standpoint, unless somebody has an accident and turns over a tanker truck, something like that.
Right.
But it definitely will kill a lot of vegetation really quick. So if you're really looking for something to brown everything, that's your treatment.
I need to update my
expensive.
I need to update my numbers for the financial calculations I typically run for a pine forest. My average chemical treating is 75, 85. So yeah, I need to.
Not anymore.
Yeah, I think our bottom line's about to get a little closer to the bottom.
It'll come back.
Yeah,
it'll come back, but not this year.
No,
not this year. And it dang sure wasn't that way this last year. It got really expensive for folks. It had gotten down to a point where it was kind of like, why not do it? Why not? When I first got in forestry, $95 an acre was kind of norm, and that was kind of where people were starting to really do it. And like I said, 2019, 2020, there were people literally having site preparation done for in the neighborhood. Well, 2018, 2019, 2020 it went up. I saw it as low as $54 an acre in Northeast Mississippi. And that same company right now is going to charge you $120, and they have to.
Yeah.
It is what it is.
Yeah.
So what I really talked about there was chemical site preparation for pines and hardwoods can be the same, but there's some extra considerations that go into hardwoods, right? And I'll ask you, Sean, what's the purpose of pine herbicides? What do they do? What's the intent?
I want to knock everything out.
You want to kill all the hardwood, right?
Yeah. I want to clear out anything that's going to compete with those pines.
Absolutely. So forest herbicide money for research and development, right? the vast slug of it goes for ag, for any kind of herbicide company. The vast majority of their R&D money goes for agriculture. The little bit that trickles down and makes it past turf and range and some of those other things, makes it down into forestry, is dropping the bucket. All of that, I didn't say most of it, I said all of that goes for developing pine herbicides, because that's where the push has been for the last 50, 60 years. Because of that, there are a few things that are labeled for use, over-the-top use in hardwoods. They're very, very far and few between. But those compounds are an accident, basically, that came out of, or incidental, I can't say an accident, incidental that came out of pine silviculture, pine herbicide development, where it didn't really work over there, but it controlled broadleaf weeds, or it controlled grasses, or something like that really, really well. So that's when we're talking over the top, something that's post-plant. When we're talking about, pure site preparation, anything you can use in pines, you can use in hardwoods.
Yeah.
You just have to think about that window of time between application and, basically putting your seedlings in the ground. Yep. So with pines, depending on the species of pine and a few other things, you can throw out 2 months, as little as 2 months between application and planting. 60 days is what the label's going to tell you, except for, and they have these other caveats, right? 3 months is absolutely you're gonna be hunky dory. You're gonna be good to go. In loblolly, there's some differences when you start looking at longleaf and some things like that, but in loblolly, you're gonna be good to go. Hardwoods, most people are gonna tell you wait at least 4 months. Every now and then you hear somebody say 3 months, and you're probably going to see some dinging up of the leaves out there. 4 months is really, really about as close in as I want to go. I'd rather, depending on the treatment, I'd really rather you see stretch a little bit further out. So instead of going, planting in December after an October application, you're going to want to say, no, I need that to be an August application. So that window has to be wider to not damage those hardwoods.
But that's not a function of the type of the herbicides. It's a
function of the
physiology,
susceptibility of that species to the herbicide.
Gotcha.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So whatever you can apply in that, on pines, you can apply in hardwoods. You just need to think about that window of time between application and planting. The other thing is, because of that window of time, don't expect growing season control out of your site preparation application, right? There's a half-life. Everything has a half-life. So the further out you stretch it, the earlier into the year you get, the half-life comes into play sooner the next year. So you don't get that control from a chemical site preparation in hardwoods that you would application in hardwoods than you would in pines. Because of that, herbaceous weed control is really where we're going to go, and that can be pre-plant or it can be post-plant, right? Really, we're going to probably suggest herbaceous weed control with something that's going to be hardwood friendly anyway. And in those situations, something like sulfametron, you can put directly over the top of hardwoods prior to bud break. So if you're out there before even the buds start swelling up, right? If you go prior to bud break, you can spray right over the top. So you plant in December, let's say, or January. You can actually go out there in February in the south part of the state, maybe even into early March in the north part, depending on how they're emerging, and you're good to go. You're safe. And so you get that window of control into the year that you don't get out of the actual chemical site preparation. Not really site prep. It's a totally different category of application, but and you're not trying to kill the woodies in that case in hardwoods. You're trying to keep the woody species, right? So what we're putting out there is not gonna take out any woody species that potentially are problematic or from a competitive advantage with the hardwood you're planting. If you have that kind of stuff on site, you're going to need to do the site prep. We don't have the ability to put sulfametron over the top of oaks and kill the sweet gum.
Right.
It just we don't have it out there. It doesn't exist. That's a really quick rundown of mechanical and chemical site prep as a whole. And most of what I said there is regional. Obviously, from a chemical standpoint, pay attention to those labels. There are herbicides that are, I can think of one in particular in Mississippi that's labeled for Mississippi and Louisiana that is not labeled in other states. And vice versa. I can think of a couple that are labeled in other states that are not labeled in Mississippi. They have special use permits. So, be careful. Always pay attention to that label. But odds are you're probably not going to get in too much trouble for you from a biological standpoint. But that financial standpoint, if somebody comes back checking on you and you applied it in a unapproved manner, may bite you, right? Excuse me. There are quite a few publications out there in our literature database that you can really dig into and get a lot of information specific to timber type. I know there's one on mixed pine hardwoods. We have one on loblolly. We have one on longleaf. We have one for hardwoods specifically. And then different treatments for that go past just chemical site prep. But there's a lot of literature in MSU Extension's literature database that gives the listeners, if they're interested in finding some of that information, gives them a really deep rundown, and you'll see some trade names mentioned in there and things like that. But treatment specific, multiple treatments for specific uses, so different herbicides that are used. A lot of literature that's out there that's available for someone if they're interested in it. We also have some on mechanical site prep that really gets into what the individual treatments do and corrective issues that they can help you with and things like that, and cost rundowns. So that's really the nitty gritty on site preparation. I don't really have much else to say other than probably the most important thing you're going to do for establishment standpoint for a forest is your chemical site preparation. I'm sorry, your site preparation, be it mechanical or chemical, because it sets the stage for the entirety of that stand as it goes through. You get a shoddy chemical site preparation application, you're going to have other species that are going to grow in. A lot of times they're going to grow better than whatever you planted in with that stand. So you have to deal with it later on if you don't deal with it.
And I've alluded to this in several of the episodes, but I mean that's why site prep's so valuable. I mean, biologically it's so important, and financially it's so important, because whether or not you have a 30-year pine stand or maybe a 50, 60, or 80-year hardwood stand, you're carrying those costs for a long time. And we talked about it a little bit in the tax episode. We'll talk about it more when I talk about comparisons between the Mississippi Reforestation Tax Credit and cost share programs. But there is a lot of help out there for reforestation efforts, which of course site prep is a integral component of that. But you still have to pay attention to your cost, because you're carrying them for such a long period of time, and you don't have any revenue to offset them for, at a minimum, if you're talking from the very get-go, right, at a minimum, 12 years, probably closer to 15, maybe even 17, depending on your site quality, things like that. So we'll cover more of that, but this is really setting the table. And so you really need to pay attention here. If you start out correctly, you can afford mistakes later on a lot easier than you can afford a mistake here.
Absolutely. Oh, I guess that wraps us up. We're getting longer on these things, man.
I think so. Yeah, we're doing good.
We don't want to burden people too much. But that's all I've got. If you're good.
Yeah, just please reach out to us if you have any follow-up questions. And Brady, Dr. Self mentioned some of those publications that he's got. So if you want to read more about it, or if you need to chat with somebody, just reach out to us by email, timberuniversity at gmail.com.
The Timber University podcast has been brought to you by Mississippi State University Extension Forestry and the University of Arkansas at Monticello's Forest Business Center.
If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email us at timberuniversity, all one word, at gmail.com.